Okay, good morning everyone. So thank you very much for your time attending this session. Uh, don't worry because this session is actually recorded. So we are in a process of recording session so that later you can go back to watch it again if ever some concept or discussion are unclear, and you can use the chat box to post your comments or clarification with regards to discussion. But I'm going to accommodate those clarification after my discussion. And of course, from time to time, I'm going to look at your comments in the chat box. So, uh, okay, let's start. So, uh, in today's meeting, so these are the topics that I'm going to discuss. Number one, I'm going to review on the concepts of loops and list box. So we will be having a discussion, short discussion of the previous modules as well as the previous examples that I have given, because some of you might not have yet fully understand the concepts of especially the activities for task. And second, we will be discussing a new topic called the predefined methods. You are actually using actually a methods, but you are not yet aware what methods are and how do they work and how to use them. And also, I'm going to discuss the C# user-defined methods, which means it's a user-defined. When we say user-defined, you are the one who will develop a method that can be used throughout your program. Okay, so let us start with the discussion of our previous module. Okay. So in our module, we have several examples that we actually talk about, especially on week number 4. So in our week number 4, we discuss the concept of uh, counters and accumulators, and it is in connection with the topics that has been discussed in week 3. Okay, so in this example, so in this task, it's a program that allows us to generate a bill for a customer. But in this particular task, there are several components that you need to apply. Number one, aside from the text box and labels, you will be developing a summary computations of the transaction. So, but you need to take consideration of the format that is being used here. So, we have, in my module, I have discussed the format. So, let me go back to the module in week 3, which is focuses on the format of okay. So let's go back to the week 3. Let's go back to the week 3. So the purpose of the objectives of this lesson in week 3 is to identify the loop structure and how are you going to use the loop structure. Okay, and we are going to identify the difference between a for loop and a do-while loop. Okay, so examine how loop produce an outputs and distinguish break in continuous statements. Okay, and also develop a program. So during this week, I have given an example that produce a certain output. Okay. Now, before we start, let us consider focusing on what is looping. So some of you might have asked, what is looping? Why is it necessary for us to study looping? No. So let me give you a clear discussion. I hope ma-clear natin siya. So first, let us focus on program structure. In a program structure, meron tayong tatlo. Okay, let me illustrate them. Okay. So we have three structures in programming. We have what we call sequence. When you say sequence, your program is arranged into a particular order. So you have to declare variables, get the inputs, perform computation, introduce and output. That is what you call sequence. Okay? Which means the code is arranged into an order from 1 to n. So it depends upon how many codes that you have, as long as the instruction is executed one at a time and it is sequential. The second structure of our program is what you call conditional statement. Okay? So conditional statements. And we already tackled this in our previous course. When you say conditional, there is a certain criteria that needs to identify on which particular path your code or your program will process. Let's say this is process 1 and this is process number 2. Okay? Now the difference now between the sequence and conditional is, in sequence, as I have said, sequential from 1 to n. But in conditional, there is somewhat reordering. So which means if you have a code that provides instruction to your program, let's say for example, you have a certain line, okay, of code that has a particular block that needs to identify. So for example, this is block number 1 or process number 1 and this is process number 2. So there is a reordering. And in order to do that, you need to provide condition. Conditions are statements that are answerable by yes or no or true or false. If a condition satisfies a true condition or a true path, which means the condition provides true output, so a block of a statement is executed. Otherwise, the other block, which means only a certain block is executed but not all. That's why it's called reordering. Because when a certain block is executed, the other one is discarded and it will go to the next set of statement of your program. So that is conditional. You need to satisfy a certain condition in order for your program to execute a certain block. It's like putting a logic in your program which particular block needs to execute based on a certain condition. Okay? Gets? Naintindihan ako? Naintindihan? You can reply on the chat box so that I could identify if things are clear. Okay. Now, that is conditional statement. Conditional statement has several types. Okay. So, for example, we have single alternative. Okay. Let's go back to our example. The reason of discussing this is for to be able to understand the flow of the program. Okay. Now, we have single alternative. When we say single alternative, your program has an option to process a certain block based on a particular condition, which means only if the condition is satisfied, a certain process is executed. Otherwise, it will continue processing the preceding lines or the preceding process. It's like an optional type of condition. So the outcome is being determined. If the condition is satisfied, then process 1 executed. Otherwise, nothing will happen. It will proceed to the next line after your condition. So that is, we call that single alternative. So the example presented in the previous discussion, this one, is we call that binary, meaning to process ang pagpipilian niya. Or The choices that needs to be taken by your program is to particular process. Okay. Now, the other one is the binary, which is this one, the common structure that is being used by students. Now, there are some cases that when do we apply this particular binary and single alternative? There are some cases that, let's say for example, let's have some example. Let's say for example, in binary, there is a certain case like when a customer, let's say for example, receive a total of 500 total of amount, you will receive a 5% discount. If not, wala. So the purpose of doing that is to only a certain amount is being granted with a particular discount. So therefore, we need to apply a single alternative, which means papasok lang sa discount kung greater than 500. So therefore, when you develop a program to that, isang condition lang, then isang outcome lang, then other than that, wala na. So punta ka na sa isang condition. So let me give an example. Let's say, hanapin ko lang example na ni-discuss ko sa programming to ko, because it also provides example the same ano. Okay, so let me provide a slide for that. Okay. Anyway, the syntax for C++ and C# are the same. Okay, so this one. This is a comparison of the difference between single alternative and binary selection. So notice, when your program execute a task, it actually depends on a particular condition here. So this one is optional. When you see optional, dadaan lang siya pag na-met yung condition na to. If not, punta na siya sa process number 2. While binary, may particular each path, which is the true path, and the false part, meron siyang pagpipilian na process kung anong i-execute niya. Okay, if there are certain process that needs to be executed after that condition, so yun na yung pupuntahan niya. Pero the execution is the program only selects one among those two based on the condition. Okay, clear? Okay, now the third part, or the third process, or the third type of conditions is what you call multi-branch. When we say multi-branch, it's several conditions need to be satisfied, and that's the time you are going to use the if, else if conditions. Okay, so because we have several processes that needs to be execute depending on your conditions. And also you can also use switch statement to execute those tasks. So yun, the difference between if else and switch is switch, you are certain for a particular choice. Example, you have choice, let's say defined na yung choice niya. Let's say pipili siya ng it's either B, either A, B, or C, something like that. So given na yung choice na, ibig sabihin, hindi mo na kailangan magtanong. All you have to do is to match the input of the user to the cases. Unlike doon sa conditional, magtatanong ka pa. Ang value ba na input niya A? Ang value ba na input niya ay C? Or siya ba ay greater than 5 and less than 10? Something like that. If your program requires you to identify specific let's say inputs or range, gagamit kayo ng if. Pero kung defined ang choice, kagaya nito, wala siyang ibang choice kundi piliin yung tatlo, otherwise error, so gamit na lang kayo ng switch. That's the difference. Okay? Now, ano naman yung looping? Okay, looping. So sa looping, that's what we call repetition structure, or what we call iteration. So looping is the process of repeatedly execute one or more steps of an algorithm or program. It is essential in programming because it is the most programs perform repetitious tasks. Okay, why do we need to use repetition? So let me illustrate that example. So balik tayo rito sa aking blank canvas and let me illustrate better example. Okay, let us remove that. Okay, now why do we need to use loop? Let's say for example, you have a robot that requires you to program, and your robot must accomplish a task that he needs to move from one place A to place B. So he needs to do some steps in order to move himself from point A to point B. So as you can see, our robot has only 2 legs, so therefore, these are left, right, and so on hanggang makapunta siya rito. Now, notice the pattern the robot needs to perform. He only needs to take at least 2 steps, and these 2 steps is unique because it is actually repeated from one to another and so on. So this is what you call repetition of tasks, and you should not write statements that multiple times siya sinusulat kasi nga ang mangyayari, since repetition siya, time consuming and hahaba ng haba yung code mo. So what loop does is you only need to execute 2 items and you need to satisfy a condition until hindi na siya masatisfy at mag-i-stop na siya. So that's the purpose of looping. It's like performing task over and over again until such time na kailangan niya mag-stop. Okay, that's actually looping. Okay? So, imagine that particular scenario. So, what will happen to you if you don't use loop? You keep on writing several repetition of a statement. What if nagkaroon ka ng mali? So, you need to modify each line over and over again kasi ang dami mong repetition na sinulat and time comes na kailangan palitan. So, multiple times siyang papalitan. But in case naman dito, all you have to do is to change 2 lines, then good to go ka na. Okay? So that's the purpose of looping. I just illustrated a particular example like robot. Okay? Now, in my example, in my module, I provided several examples like yung paggamit ng while loop. Ano po? Now, there are several types of loops. Okay? So, let us focus on that. Okay. In looping, we have what we call pre-test and post-test loop. So, in pre-test, the condition is tested first before execution of task. So, as you notice, mostly, gumagamit tayo ng while loop and for loop for this. Pre-test loop. Pag post-test, gumagamit tayo ng while loop. Okay. Anong pinagkaiba ng pre-test loop sa while loop? Okay. So, or do while loop. Okay, so anong pinagkaiba nila between those two? The difference now is the condition. So, anong pinagkaiba nila? The pre-test loop, the loop condition is tested before entering a particular loop or statement. Now, how about do while? Do while, the test of the loop condition occurs after the body of the loop is carried out or executed. So, the statements in the body of the loop are always executed at least 1 time. Okay? So, for example, illustrate ulit tayo ng example. Okay, erase natin to. Okay, so for example, we have a do while loop. So, in do while, the first thing you need to consider is the control variable. Let's say I equals 1. Okay? So, this is your control variable. So, this allows us to control or the counter. Okay? Ang tawag natin sa kanya is counter, or madalas ko siyang binabanggit as control variable because this is the variable that allows the loop to become false. And you have the while loop. Let's say while, let's say I less than 5. or equal to 5, let's say 5 times siya mag-execute, something like that. And nandito yung process mo na gagawin sa loop. And I plus plus. Okay. Notice there are 3 types of parts of the loop. The first one is this, the counter, initialization. So you initialize your counter. Pangalawa is your condition. The condition allows us to check whether we need to execute the process or not. Third is the body of the loop. In the body of loop, we always make sure always make sure that the counter is being incremented. Yes? May nagsasalita. Ano po yun?
Yes po, sir.
Hindi nakikita. Okay, sige po. Okay. Light color. Okay, sige. Thank you. Okay, raise natin. Okay. So, for example, start tayo. So, in a body of loop, so let's say letter I equals 1. I think it's better now. Okay, so yun. So, this is what you call your initialization or your counter. Okay. Counter. Okay. So, we always initialize our loop because that variable is our test condition in order to execute a certain body of loop. Let's say I is less than equal to 5. Let's say, for example, we only need to execute the process 5 times. Something like that. Okay. So, for example, this is your process. Let's say process. So, and I plus plus. Okay, so the purpose of doing this is to always check when do we need to execute the loop. We will going to execute the loop if your I variable is less than or equal to 5. Since the value of the initialization of letter I is 1, so it's true because it's less than equal to 5, right? Now, so your loop will be executed. Now, hanggang kailan siya ma-execute? Ma-execute siya hanggat ang I is less than 5. Pag equal to 6 na siya, the loop will stop and go to the next line of your program. Now, kailan siya magkakaroon ng chance na mag-false? Kasi always true siya. Because of this particular line. Because you always update the value of I to increment 1 every time the loop is executed, the body of loop is executed. So, you always make sure that you update this variable so that your loop will not go an infinite loop. Okay? So, yun. Is my writings now clear? Nababasa na ba? Medyo pangit lang sulat ko sa screen but it's white na siya. Okay na ba?
Nakikita.
Okay, nawala ako.
Sir.
Nakikita na. Medyo nadi-disconnect ako from time to time. But anyway, okay na po.
Okay na po, sir.
Okay. Now, that is while loop. Now, this same siya with for loop. Okay. For loop is different because the difference now is all of this statement here, in here, condition, and incrementation or decrementation as is placed in one statement, like I equals 1, I is less than equal to 5, then I plus plus. So yun, and this now your body of loop. Okay, that's is for loop. So these are what you call pre-test loop. It tests first a condition before executing a body of loop. When do we use pre-test loop? We use this particular type of looping if we are certain how many times we want our loop or the process needs to execute several times. Which means, define na natin ilan beses ko siya dapat execute. 5 times, 10 times, and so on. Ano po? And although naka pre-test siya, there are several types of loops that you need also to consider. let's say sa while loop, meron tayong tinatawag na counter control. This is an example of counter control kasi nga, nagdidepende sa counter kung ilang beses siya mag-iikot. But what if, sir, hindi ko alam kung how many times. Basta ang alam ko, hanggat meron siyang nababasa, dapat read lang siya ng read, something like that. So magkakaroon tayo ng chance to do that in several lessons pa. Siguro pagdating natin sa database or some examples will be presented later. Now, in other situation, meron tayong tinatawag na sentinel control. When sentinel control, ibig sabihin, the user needs to input a value so that the loop will stop from looping. Okay, so that's what we call sentinel loop. Now, what is the difference now between, or what is the Postus loop? So, let's say, trace natin siya. So, pag sinabing Postus, ibig sabihin, gagawin mo muna yung process bago mo siya tanungin if the condition is true. So, I less than equal to 5. Okay. So, kailan natin siya ginagamit? Okay. So, ginagamit natin siya kung number 1, gagawa muna siya ng process. Example, when you ask the user to perform a let's say calculation first or input first before asking, do you want to continue? You say, do you want to continue? Something like that. Continue. Kasi na-process na siyang una. So, yes or no. Something like that. So, pag siya ng yes, saka siya babalik. Mag-i-stop lang yan kung sumagot siya ng no. Diba? So, that's the basic implementation of the do-while loop. Okay, clear na po ba? Clear na po ba? Clear na? Okay, so let's have some example using our C# language. So, I have here a blank form. I don't know if nakikita siya, but let me construct a list box kasi ito naman talaga yung ginagamit natin for displaying a data. Let's say for example, I'm going to maximize the size of my list box so that kahit nasa phone kayo, it's easier to read. Okay. Arial. Okay. 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 Now, I have now. Okay, so let's try. Okay. So. Okay. Now, in C++, C# rather, palitan natin yung font. Okay. How do we add data to list box? I already provided a discussion about this in my module. Siguro ang iba hindi lang masyado nagbabasa, but anyway, so let us hide this one. Okay, now, I think it's clear now. Okay, clear na siya. Ano? Yeah. Now, how do we add data to list box? So, first, you need to call the name of the list box. So, let us name this one LST data. Something like that. Okay, let's go back. Okay, so in order to add data to your list box, all you have to do is to call the list box data, and you must specify a property, items. Okay, items. Okay, capital I to be exact, then add. Okay, so you can add either number, something like that. Okay, try natin tong number. Okay, you can add string. Let's say for example, hello world. Okay, something like that. So the difference now is may meron tayong double quotation for string and none for numeric. Another example, let's say 94 or 98.56, something like that. So let's try. So when you run that application, okay, so now this is now your application and view. Ayan. So we have now a data coming from your list. Now, let's try performing a loop. Okay, loop. Okay. Let's start with pretest loop. Okay. Pretest loop. Okay. So we'll be using the while loop. Okay. So ngayon, let's say for example, I need to generate from let's say int num equals to 1. Okay. So while num is less than or equal to 10, okay, something like that. Okay, then add natin sa list. So lsd data dot items dot add natin yung num, something like that. Okay. Okay, now, so aside from that, you have the initialization of your variable, the condition until when this line will be executed. So to make this line false, dapat there is a certain line na dapat maging false to eventually after certain times. Kaya you need to num plus plus, okay, or num plus equal 1, something like that, which means is equivalent to num plus plus, okay, something like that. So it's depend upon your preference kung alin gagamitin nyo. It's your call. Now let's try. Let's run this one. How about my code in your screen? Nakikita ba siya? Yung code ko, clear ba siya? Nakikita naman please.
Pero po.
Meron naman. Okay. So yun. So let's try. Ayan. So as you can see, I have now generated from 1 to 10. Very basic, di ba? Very basic. Now, let us try implementing. This is my question, the other activity discussion question. What if we try to display the add and even number? Let's say for example, if num person 2, okay, let's try. Oops, I have an error. Convert to int. Okay, so let's try to convert this to int. To Boolean. Okay. To 0. Okay. Now, concatenate natin is even number. Something like that. Else, by the way, no need to, it's okay not to use curly brace since one line lang naman in-execute. So, something like that. Yeah. So, this is add number. Okay, something like that. So, okay. So, let's try. Okay, so now, my code is putting conditional statement and while loop. So I am now mixing the structure. We have a sequence, we have a loop, and we have conditions. Okay. So let's try. Okay, so this is now my output and display. So one is add. Sorry, I did not provide add number, something like that. Okay. Okay, something like that. Yeah. So I have now displaying the contents of my data. Okay. So that's the basic implementation of looping. But sir, kailan ba natin talaga ginagamit maliban sa mag-display? Yes, na-encounter namin siya sa C++ and or even, but Ano ba yung Ano ba yung extension ng paggamit ng while loop? I have given example of calculating the balance of a certain amount, something like that. But sir, yes, I already familiar with that. But in a, let's say for example, in the industry, pag gumagawa kayo sir ng program, kailan yung madalas ginagamit ang loop? Ginagamit ko madalas ang loop, especially pag magre-read ng data sa database. Okay? Kasi when you read data from database, you're expecting that reading several records. So when you read several records, you need to execute at least siguro mga several lines. But when you are not familiar how many records do you need to read, that's the time I'm using loop. Because if the records is too much to count, so I'm using loop to allows the program to identify how many times that the process needs to execute based on the following condition. Number one, may nababasa pa ba siyang data? Number two, yung record ba is present pa sa database, something like that. So that's how I usually use my loop or loop statements in a particular program. Aside from that, siguro there are several examples that you might encounter in the following days. So the most important thing here is the concept of applying loop is familiar to you. Kasi, I don't want to populate too much example and eventually makakalimutan nyo din naman. And I just want to have you to have the familiarity so that when we go to the advanced topics, madali natin siya magagamit. Okay, now, so that is now the implementation of the loop. Now, palitan natin siya ng for loop. So, for loop, okay. So, the basic functionality of for loop or the basic implementation of for loop is you need to initialize. But notice, hindi naman sa lahat ng situation si for loop kailangan yung tatlo. Ito tawag natin dito is parang counter control na siya. No, but you can initialize from start to 1 and this one x plus num plus plus something like that. Okay, so eventually this one is the same with the previous example, but the difference is how you write your loop. So you just put initialize. But yun. Sir, kailan mo ginagamit si for loop? Ganun din, situation na ganun. If I have identified the exact number of data, so pwede yung mangyari. No? Kailan dito, alam na natin na 1 to 10, something like that. So that's the implementation of for loop. Okay, balikan natin si post test. Post test. Sabi ko dito, post test is ginagawa mo muna yung task bago siya nag-execute ng condition. So for example, we'll try to implement, let's say, I want the user to input a certain number, but we need to ask them, do you want to continue or not? Something like that. So let's type do. Okay, do. Okay, gawa tayo. Let's say for example, input box. Okay, input box. Okay, wala tayong input box dito. So lagay tayo ng additional library para makapag tayo, tawag natin dyan, makagamit ng input box. So hindi kasi siya by default, hindi siya tawag natin dito, hindi siya added doon sa ating default library. So siguro ang iba napansin to, sir, ang dami naman ito, ano ba to? So para po yan doon sa ating form, tawag natin yan, form design. So we'll be using the system that Windows that interaction. Oh, wala. Wait lang. Okay, Microsoft, mali pala yung library ko. Microsoft Visual Basic. So try natin. Input box. Oh, wala pa rin. Input. Tara lang. Dagdagan natin. That interaction. Baka kulang ako. Ayaw eh. Ayaw. Balikan natin. Interaction. Not supported. Bakit kaya? Wait lang. Interaction. That ayaw. Teka lang. Microsoft Visual Basic. Okay naman. There is something missing. Wait lang. Let me Okay. Interaction. Namespace does not exist. Okay. Nakalimutan ko yung interaction. Wait lang. Sige, try natin. Gawin natin mano-mano. Okay. Let's say date string alisin ng was Microsoft. Balik natin to. Okay, using Microsoft Visual Basic. Okay. Was interaction. Wala talaga. Input box. Ayaw Baka hindi na supported dito sa version ko. Okay, wait lang. Let me hindi kasi ako madalas gumagamit ng ng input box. Okay, forms meron na. Okay. Okay.
So,
Ano yun? Okay, wait lang. Sino may internet dyan? Google natin. Okay. Inirapan tayo nito System, Visual Basic. Okay. Sino na nakatry nito?
next meeting,
Nakalimutan ko yun.
Pero, ang shooting natin simula sa March 29. Shooting, so, natin kita sa incomes mo lang. Casual man lang. Basta luwag man lang, luwag ng exposure.
Okay, WinForms.
Normal web, naka-forward by, tapos WinForm.
Okay.
Si Janelle ang kapartner ng
Anyway, let's devise some example. So do while, let's say for example,
Mag-GG yun.
Okay. List LST.
Hindi naman na shooting.
Balikan ko yung example mamaya. Items that add num.
Mali ka taong si kayo. Dito sa tig.
Okay. So while
Ano yun? Kada tintig duluga.
9 is less than equal to 5. So, the difference between the post-test and pre-test, the post-test, kailangan niya muna mag-execute na at least once. So, kahit gawin natin tong 6,
O, 6 na, nagsubmit na.
still may makikita tayong output because execute kasi niya muna bago tanong kung true or false. So, let's try. Okay, so this one, ayan na siya. Okay. So, display. Yan. Notice nyo, it only outputs 6 because once this statement is executed, the program needs to check whether this condition is valid or not. Since this is not valid anymore because the value of num is 6, does not confirm with less than or equal to 5, but your program executes this one or displays the value of 6. So, at least once na-execute natin siya. So, yun. That's the example that we usually do in post-test. Saan sa sir madalas ginagamit? Usually, depending on a particular situation. Let's say for example, in C++, ginagamit natin siya for allowing the user to perform task first before checking to perform another task, something like that. Ano po? Now, another lesson that I have mentioned in my module, hanapin natin siya.
Okay, sagutan mo.
Okay. Is the implementation of the format. This one. Okay. Implementation of the format.
Paano ka maka-influensya sa sarili mo, sa community, sa ibang tao?
Ano ba yun? Okay, this one. How do we implement this one? So format, some of you are confused about this one. So let's try doing that in our example. Okay, so let's erase this one. Okay, erase natin to. Oops. The program is still running, so let us close this one. Okay, let us remove. Okay, now let's create an example that allows us to input certain data. Let's say tawagin natin tong receipt. Okay, something like that. And gawa tayo ng label. Okay, and tutorial natin 16. Okay, let's say tawagin natin siyang name. Okay, something like that, and we need to ask the user to input the data. Let's see, text box. Okay, tutorial. Okay, tawagin natin sa txt customer. So let us repeat. Let's say for example, let's say hours work. Hours work. Okay, something like that. To list. Okay. And then, in our output, in our list, we need to create 3 columns. The first one, so let us define. In our output, let's say for example, lagay natin dito yung name, kunwari lang. Okay. So, I'm just putting a label so that you can identify what is the possible output. Let's say name. Okay. And then, lagay natin yung hours work. sa gitna, kunwari lang dito, hours work, and dito yung kanyang salary sa dulo. Remove natin later yan sa something like that. So ngayon, the purpose of format output is for us to be able to set columns. So we call that zoning. Pag sinabing zoning, yung isang line ng text, let's say punta tayo sa illustration. So output zoning, you try to separate or create a string that compose of several columns. So let's say for example, you have a particular line of text na pwede mong separate by column. Column 1, 2, 3, and 4. To do that, you must declare that a string needs to have a zone. So to do that in your C# application, you need to declare a certain format. Example, string, let's say format, may format. Okay. So equals, in declaring a format, you need to enclose how many columns do you need. So I need 3 columns, something like that. In those 3 columns, how many characters does the column supports? Let's say for example, in first column, since this is a name, so I need 15 characters. And if your string needs to display in a left aligned portion of your left portion of your window, so you put negative. If right aligned, so it's a positive number. So yun. So now, second column, so notice the arrangement of columns starts in 0. It's like array, so 0. So since this is ours work, let's say 5. And the last one, number 2, let's say 15, something like that, or 12 characters, something like that. And format, let's say this is numeric. So what are the possible format that you need to apply in order to apply zoning? Or when you apply zoning, you put colon and numeric, and let's say no decimal, so 0. And this one, let's put 2 decimals, so and 2, something like that. Okay. Now, when the user, let's say name, customer, okay, something like that, string hours work equals 0, and string string int. Okay, let me check, baka may mag-join. Okay, so let's say double salary equals 0, that's 0, something like that. Okay, now how do we add data from the list? First, you need to get the customer name equals txt customer. So no need to get the or convert, since it's text box string. Then hours equals txt. Oh, nakalimutan ko lagyan ng pangalan. So let me rename the text box hours. Okay, it's either use int.parse or convert that to integer. Let's say 1632. The difference between 1632 and 64, the supported size of your depending on your computer, let's say txt hours. So I have presented several ways to convert. Okay, now let us try to compute. Let's say salary equals hours multiplied by hours. Sorry. Let's say 100, something like that. Okay, sample lang. Okay. Ngayon, let us display your output. So lst data.items.add. Okay. So in order to add the data from list box, you will not usually perform the regular like customer, something like that. I-add mo siyang ganyan. Okay? Kasi ang mangyayari, pag nag.add ka, that is considered as one line or one row. And sometimes, ang ibang ginawa, and. Tapos gawa siya ng space. Pag ginawa mo kasi yan, hindi na siya particularly nakaset sa column. So, in order to do that, na nakaset sa column, you need to use string dot format. Okay? So, using this method allows you to use a particular format that you define. So, for example, I'm using the format method, and the format that I'm using is this particular format, FNT, that contains 3 columns. So, FNT. Okay, FNT, comma. So, notice I have, let me hide this one. So, notice I have 2 parentheses, so I need to close other one. So, yun. Then, inside the inner parentheses, you need to type the first column, followed by second column, followed by third column, something like that. Okay? As easy as that. So, which means, we have a tree data that follows a certain format that we define. So, what will happen here is your data is now contained in a particular zone. So let's start displaying. So say for example, we have this data. Let's say John, hours work, let's say 54. So notice, since let us count the columns, although I did not follow the correct column numbers, that's why it's like this. But notice it's now arranged into particular column. But let us try to change the sizes. Let's say for example, this is 20. Okay, and this is 15. Okay, this is 25. Okay, so let's try. Okay. So John, 54 hours. Ayan. So meron na tayong particular arrangement. As you can see, no matter how many times I input a number, still the arrangement is the same. Okay? Same column, right? So yun. Let's say 1. 23 hours, something like that. Okay. By the way, as you can see, sir, your example provides column, but why is it some of the characters are not arranged in a particular set or arranged in a way that is properly aligned? It's because my font is not particularly focusing on the sizes of text, but notice the size of letter O is different from letter A or letter E. So, in order to correct that display, you need to convert or change the font in your list box by a particular format or font that has a equal number of sizes per letter. So, notice nyo sa mga receipt na na-receive nyo sa mga department store, ang font niya parehas, or it's like the letters are the same sizes. Let's say Courier New. Courier New. Okay. So this assure that, okay, medyo malaki. Babaan natin yung size niya. Consume tayo ng ano. Okay, so let's try. So the purpose of using this font is for me to properly align the text. Although I'm using a column but it's not properly aligned. Jane 45. Yun. Oops. Sumobra yung size ko. So let me change the sizes. Let's say 15. Okay. 18. Okay. Just more of ano. Okay, so let's go back. So now let's try to check Jane 45. Okay, so I guess medyo okay na siya kahit papano. Babaan natin. Sayang. Let's say 15 din. Okay, now I guess okay na to. So let's okay, Jane 45. Yan. Now let's try to add another John. Let's say 35 hours. Notice it's now properly aligned. And let's say Juan San nakamali na. Jose Rizal. Let's say 56. So notice it's now properly aligned. So that's the purpose of writing format. Sir, saan po siya madalas ginagamit? So let me give you an illustration or example. Let me look for my program first. Okay. Pakita ko sa inyo example kung saan siya madalas ginagamit. I already mentioned this. Di ba, when you receive receipt from Jollibee, etc. or department store, madalas nyo siyang nakikita sa receipt kung saan may mga particular number kayong nakikita. So let me open my sample database kasi meron akong program niyan. Gusto ko bigyan kayo ng sample para ma-appreciate nyo. Okay? So let's say i-run ko lang ng konti yung program. Meron pa tayong isang topic. Anyway, kung di natin maabot yung walang problema, I just post the PowerPoint presentation in your LMS. Then I will give some example para okay. Let's have some example para ma-appreciate nyo. Okay. So habang hinahanap yung example ko, pwede kayo tanong if ever. Okay, clarification so far. Do you have any question? Pwede kayo magsulat sa comment section. If ever may tanong. May tanong po kayo? Hello? Okay, let me look for that example first. Okay, I encountered some error. Okay. Yun lang, error yung program ko. Anyway, let us identify. Okay, nagkaroon tayo ng problema. Okay. Wait lang ha, for a moment. Kasi hinahanap ko yung error niya.
Gulay lang sa account. Tapos, wala na rice. Kasya?
Missing funds.
Ay? Wala.
Okay, so let's try to run the application. Sorry for the delay. Okay, so I have here an example. Let's say, for example, this is a department store program. So, as you can see, meron tayo dito parang POS system. Example. So, let's say, maghahanap siya ng product. Okay, hanapin ko lang yung products. Okay. So, ganito madalas makita yung mga ano. Mamaya magpuproduce siya ng ano, receipt. So, lagay tayo ng product, code. Kunwari, ayan. So, meron na tayong quantity. Okay. And another, iscan tayo ulit, naging 2 na. Iscan pa tayo ulit, naging 3. So, total 360. 120 ang isa pa ulit. Iscan ulit tayo. So, ngayon, gagawin na natin, F2, cash tender tayo. Okay, let's say for example, 500. Okay. So, may change ang 200. And, let's say save. Okay. Saan yung receipt ko? Hinahanap ko yung receipt. Wait lang. Ayaw mag-display ng receipt. Okay. Kasi gusto ko pakita sa inyo yung example na may receipt siya. Okay. Saan na yun? Okay. So, try natin i-display yung receipt. Okay. Okay, so ito yung example ng receipt. Notice nyo, ayan, wala lang siyang product pero ganito pinuproduce. Notice nyo may mga numbering ako. Ito yung ginagamit ko na parang reference kung anong spacing ang gagawin. So, gano'n lang. That's the purpose of the zoning. You can specify the size of the characters, of the columns, etc. So, I hope na-appreciate nyo siya. Sige, hanap tayo ng ano. Next, okay. Next example tayo para makaproceed tayo sa next. Okay, in my previous examples also, there is a certain case that you need to read data coming from the list box. So, tanggalin na natin ito. Ano? So, instead of writing columns, gawa tayo ng another example. Okay, balik tayo rito. And instead, siguro input na lang tayo ng number. Okay, let's say number. For grades, something like that. So, grades. Okay. So, in my example, grades yung in-input, correct? Okay. So, ngayon, try natin i-add yung kanyang grade. So, lst data.add. Ngayon, hindi na ako mag-specify ng let's say validation. Instead, I'm going to manually add the data. So we need to have int or double grade. Okay, equals 0. Okay, grade equals convert to double txt hours kasi yun eh. Kunwari lang ha. Importante makuha natin data. So para ma-add natin siya sa list box, okay, simple as that. Okay. Now, we need to add an analyze button. Let's say for example, analyze daw natin siya. Analyze. Okay, analyze. Analyze. Spelling. Analyze. Yan. Okay, so yun. So, okay, btn analyze. Okay. And then, we need to present our analysis into another list box. Kunwari lang. So, let's say, for example, okay, dito na lang sa baba. Okay, so something like that. Okay. So let's rename this LST data 2, something like that. Okay, now let's try adding the data first. Okay. So grade, let's say 88, add to list, 89, 78, something like that. So the purpose of analysis is to read the data coming from the list box one by one and analyze, let's say for example, how many pass and how many are failed, something like that. So let's try. So in order to determine the data coming from your list box, I already mentioned that in our discussion in, I think, week 2, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, there are some cases there that are examples that are mentioned. Ito, for example, selected index. The purpose of this is to identify if a particular list has a selected item, something like that. And this one, selected index, is used to identify selected item in the list. So let's try to use that. Okay. And the purpose of count is to count how many items are in our list box. So let's try. So int total. When I say total, we are trying to identify how many data item that count. Oops. Count. Okay. Something like that. So which means na-count natin siya. So therefore, ito yung magsisilbi nating maximum times that the loop needs to read our data from list box. Okay. Now, let's provide a while loop. Okay. In iteration, iter, something like that. Now, the list coming from your list box starts at 0. Okay, so while number of iteration is less than total, so we need to check. So let's say grade, so double grade equals 0. So the purpose of this variable is to get the data coming from the list box. So let me give an illustration of how we are going to implement that. So for example, let's say we have a list. Let's say you have 88, 90, 100. So the data in the list box starts at 0, 0, 1, 2. So therefore, if you have 3 items in total, it always starts counting from 0. We call that index. Okay, it's like an array that starts at 0. So in order to get the value coming from our list box, you need to call the lst dot data, okay, dot item and the corresponding index. Okay, when we say index, we are referring to this one here. something like that. So when we say LST data that item 2, we are referring to this list here, the last item. Gets? That's the purpose of defining your data. So as you can see, we have what we call index or n. Okay? Okay, so let's try. So declare tayo equals 0, failed equals 0, something like that. So we need to get the value, the first or the list coming from the list box number 1. So LSD data that item, okay, so let's say iter, okay, again, since mag-start yung ating iteration sa 0, so every time na magdadagdag siya, ni-read natin yung ating list box. Okay, we have an error here. Okay, object convert to double. So okay, so yun. By the way, items that are put inside the list box considered siya as string. In order to assign that into our double variable, you need to convert that to double. Okay? Para magamit natin. So if grade is less than 75, sabihin natin failed plus plus. Otherwise, else pass plus plus, something like that. Okay, so yun. Okay, so at the end of the loop, I have instruction that prints data. So that items, oops, that add, I'm going to display number of passers. Okay, plus pass. Okay, and of course I'm going to also display number of failed. So failed, something like that. Okay, now let me explain a little bit about this code. First, we create a variable called total to count how many items that the loop will read, because if we don't do that, we cannot determine how many times this one will execute. So to do that, we need to determine ilang beses ako mag-iikot doon sa ating list box. Number 2, the iteration, ilang beses ako iikot. Or this is the control variable. In this one, the variable that allows us to read the grades from the list box number 1 and count the pass or fail. So in our loop, we create a condition that if the iteration is still less than total, so we can read the grades, check if the grade is failed or passed. After executing this loop, we will be displaying the items. And we forgot something, the iter plus plus, to update the loop para maging false na ito. Okay, so let's start. Okay, so let's start. Let's say 88, 90, 87, 72, 87, 74, something like that. So now let's analyze. So in this particular inputs, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 passers and 2 failed grades. Let's try. Sorry. Medyo lumiit yung aking ano. Ganito na lang gawin natin. Lakihan natin yung ating list box. Okay, hopefully tama na siya. Dilitan natin yung font. Okay, so let's try. Okay, grade 8, 90, 71, 89, 72, 74, 86, something like that. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 passers and possibly 3 failed grades. Analyze. Now, our counting is correct. Okay? Now, in this example, number 1, we try to add a data to a list box. And number 2, from the list box, we try to read them using the data that are coming from list box and determine which among those data are passed or failed. So that's the purpose of our program. Okay, so do you have any questions regarding this discussion? Did I satisfy the clarification that requires attention? Okay, please write your comments or questions in our chat box. May tanong po ba? May tanong? Meron po bang tanong? Yung mga nandito, kumusta? May tanong?
Nabalik ka lang mo, may list box pa lang sir na sa analyze. Kala ko sir, ano lang siya,
Depende kasi sa control kung saan mo siya output. Pwede naman kasi text box eh. All you have to do is to, pwede naman text box. Ganito. Ito. Pwede naman text box, walang problema. Kung ayun yung gumamit ng list box, pwede naman text box. So, sige, try natin ha. Okay. Oops. Okay, control. Alt na lang. Controller. Okay, kunwari. Okay. So this is for pass, this is for fail. Okay, so ano natin? Let's say for example, txt pass, txt fail. Pwede naman yun. Okay, ngayon, i-count lang natin ha. Okay. Txt pass. Wala mong pinagkaiba yan. Depende na lang kung saan nyo siya i-display. Okay. String. Okay, so let's try. Okay, now let's try to input some data. Okay, so let's say for example 88, 90, 76, 71, something like that. So in this case, we have 3 passers and 1 failed grade. So analyze. So it's correct. Okay. So that's the implementation of our program. Now, ano pa ba? Anything that you would like to add so that it can be clarified? Any other things? Question. Baka may nakalimutan ako. Baka may nakalimutan. Sure na kayo? So wala na ata akong... Anyway, may mga example ako dito that you can browse sa ating module. Okay, ano pa ba? Baka may nakalimutan pa. Task 4, task 5 daw, task 5. Let us check the task 5. Let us check the task 5 for any other missing discussion. I think yung quiz analysis, na-discuss ko na ata siya. Okay, let us wait for the application to open. Okay, so this is task number 5. Okay, you need to enter, it's a P or F. Okay, so this is a string. You can use a string about this one. So, okay. I think the analysis part here is also list box or label. Yeah, label. If you are confused about label, if you want to display that the output in a new line, just provide /n. Okay. Oh, what about this one? What about the task number Task 5. Do you have any clarification about task 5? Nakailang oras na ba tayo? Wala, ilang oras na to? Mukhang marami na. 1 hour. 1 hour 30 minutes na. Sobra na. But anyway, kung wala na kayong tanong, sure yan, wala na kayong tanong. Waiting for questions, everyone. Anyone waiting for questions? 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 I don't want to leave in our meeting na may mga tanong pa. Yes, may nagtatanong. Yes.
Sir, actually po.
Hindi
Sa
ko
ano po
marinig.
ini? Sa advanced database subject.
Ha?
Sa advanced database po, sir.
Ano po yun?
Sa advanced database po na subject.
Ano po?
Yung sa advanced database po, sir. Kasi po, sa nag-meeting po, kita sa Ron Adlaw, sabi po nido may activity po na i-upload sa LMS. Pero wala ko man po niya hanggang
Hindi ko pa siya na-upload. Sorry, hindi ko pa. Kasi maghapon ako nagklase sa online tapos siguro later. Okay. Regarding sa subject natin ngayon, yun ang pag-usapan natin muna.
Opo, sige.
Anyway, thank you for that clarification.
Opo, sir.
Okay lang. So any other clarification para ma-post ko na yung attendance nyo. Kasi masyado na tayong mahaba at yung oras nyo. Okay lang kung may tanong para ma-clarify natin. Sige na.
Sir?
Yes.
Sir,
Yes po.
may activities pa po na i-uploaded din sa integrative program po.
Kung na-discuss ko sana yung methods, meron kasi wala akong lesson for this midterm. Pero i-upload ko yung sa methods at mag-upload ako ng activities. Kaya ang mangyayari sa atin, medyo malilate muna yung exam nyo. Para mabigyan kayo ng time to submit the sample activities na dapat magawa, then saka kayo mag-exam. Or what do you prefer?
So sir, line po muna kami exam sa sa programming po.
Yes, yes. Ano pa po? May tanong pa po ba? May tanong pa po ba? Any other question? Sa chat box, wala nang chat-chat.
Wala na po.
Wala na. So kung wala na po kayong tanong, hopefully nasagutan ko yung mga tanong or mga concern na nasa isip nyo. Paki-confirm sa chat box kung nasagutan ko ba, kung malinaw. I'm not really sure kasi syempre I'm not aware kung ano yung situation nyo habang ginagawa yung activities, but I want to know, na-clear na ba yung modules from week 1 to 4? Kasi may bago tayong module from week 6, so medyo marami itong activities na to. Kunti lang naman, mga dalawa. Dalawa lang naman. Share kasi para nagre-react agad. Dalawa lang naman. Okay. Bakit, gusto mo mabasa sa chat box? May clarification pa ba? Or nasagutan ko ba yung mga tanong sa isip nyo? Wala akong nababasa sa chat box na reply. According sa mga estudyanteng nandito, wala daw silang clarification